Hey, welcome to Overtime, where we take Sunday's message further. My name is Jeremy, and I'm your host. And this is a podcast where we just want to ask the questions that we think that you would ask as it relates to Sunday's message. And as we do so, we hope that it helps you grow in your life and your faith. With that being said, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you can stay up to date on all of the podcasts that are coming out. Not only that, hit the like button, because when you do so, it helps us help other people. And if you ever have a question about Sunday's content or about Overtime, you can submit those to overtime@npaustin.com, and we will be sure to get to those in future podcasts. So with that being said, here's a conversation today. All right, well, welcome to Overtime, where we take Sunday's message further, and I'm really excited today because we are having a unique Overtime, a unique conversation. I'm sitting here with two friends of mine. Got Jordan Geist, our associate pastor, on my side, and we were sitting across from our small group leader, Jeff Brown. How are you guys doing today?
I'm doing great.
Yeah, I'm excited, man. This is like a little nostalgic.
Yeah, we're just sitting in small group again.
Yeah, and there were days we were that small. I think there were days it was just the three of us.
Yeah,
at a small group having combos.
Well, and beyond small group, we interacted a lot just with you guys being leaders.
Yeah, that's true.
So it's beyond just our small group, but all the time, with me and the other adults who are mentoring you guys as leaders of the ministry, we spent a lot of time together.
Yep.
That's fun.
And I'm also a little bit thinking about these types of conversations that happen, not here, but at Whataburger and Chick-fil-A and JJ's. And Jeff, you've bought us quite a few meals over the years.
Yes, and you guys remember the deal. It was when you guys were students, I was buying the meals, but the deal was once you guys both became big-time, high-paid pastors, which you now are, you were going to buy me a lunch or a breakfast. And I remember the day that was supposed to happen, but I'm trying to recall exactly how that went. Jordan, do you remember? You were going to buy.
Yeah, we were at Chick-fil-A, I think. I mean, we're like, this is like 5 years, I don't know, 6 years ago. And we're like hundreds of meals in probably. I mean, he's really, through that many years, weekly for lots of stretches, probably bought us that many meals.
Yep.
And I was like very confident, adamant, like I'm buying Jeff a meal. And like I had texted ahead of time. I was like, guys, it's on me today. Like want everybody to know. And like I got to the front of the line. We all ordered. And I did the like pat every pocket, like wallet is gone.
Yeah.
And it was genuine. I was so embarrassed. I was like, you're kidding me. And of course, Jeff paid for it. So I still don't think I've ever bought him a meal.
I feel like I'm the really real culprit in that scenario though, because like you were going to buy, but I was there and I had my wallet. And I was probably like, well, I guess Jeff's buying then. Like, I'm not going to offer up.
Why didn't I think of that?
Yeah, I don't know. I actually was taking all my money at that point. So it didn't work out, I guess. Yeah.
And I owe you guys a beer and your brother.
Oh, yeah.
Up.
Yeah, this is true. You're finally going to, it feels like you're avoiding us a little bit after the last.
It's taken a long time. It's embarrassing. Perhaps even makes up for the meal deficit, how long it's been for me to settle up on our bet.
Yeah. So Jeff's talking about, what was the name? It was like the Trans-Texas Virtual Run or something like that.
Yeah.
So this is, I don't know what, last summer or whatever. Yeah. Jeff texts us out of the blue and challenges us to this. It's a race like north-south across Texas.
It was east-west.
East-west across Texas.
It was like running, if you had run on Highway 10 from the Louisiana border to the New Mexico border.
Right.
879 miles.
Yeah. So Jeff's become a big runner. He's got the runner flow now and everything. I love the hair.
Yep.
It looked
Silver
amazing
Fox
in the video and everything on Sunday. I was like, I just kept looking at it.
If you see a silver fox on Brushy Creek, it's probably Jeff Brown.
Yeah. It's true. But he's like, hey guys, I know none of you individually can beat me. So if you want to get a team of 20-year-olds and run against me, count all your mileage together, let's do it. And it took out of 3 or 4 months. We did.
Yeah. Well, there's no better way to motivate the Geist brothers than to tell them they can't.
They can't do something. Still working on that.
Yeah.
And I started off in the lead and really thought I was going to beat you guys. Because about a month in, I had a pretty good head start, and every week I was adding more. Mm-hmm. And then something kicked in for Jordan. His competitive juices just like kicked in.
Yep.
Then he started running like, at that time, I think I was running 5 or 6 miles a day, 7 days a week.
Yeah.
And then Jordan started running like 7 miles every day, 6 or 7. Then it became 7. Yeah. So I upped mine to 7, and I was just running 7 miles a day, 7 days a week. So I was barely keeping up with Jordan. But then anything you and Jeremy did just put me further behind.
I literally would text them like, guys, run once this week. Like, just do something. Like, get out there.
Well, mine was pretty inconsistent. I'd have like a mile week, and then I would have like a 15-mile week.
Yeah.
And then I would be like, it holds me over for a month now. I can wait.
Yeah, I remember how excited I'd get because you like wouldn't run at all. And then you do like a 10-mile loop. And I'm like, I don't know where that came from.
I don't know where it came from either.
Yeah, it would drive me crazy
Yeah.
because I would start feeling good, like I'm making progress. And then, Jeremy throws in something like that.
Yep. Well, and I knew we were having this conversation today, and I haven't run in a while. So I got up this morning and I ran 3 miles. And
That's
I
good.
was very proud to
Yeah, we
share
need
with you.
another challenge, something to motivate us again.
Yeah, not
Yeah.
to make you feel bad or, less significant, but I did 4 this morning. Check it on Strava.
Keep up.
Oh man.
And then you saw my run.
Yeah, I did. I just looked at that in Colorado. That was pretty impressive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You should use a Jeff Brown transition to get us back to our. Speaking of
Yes.
running.
Yes. So in small group, all of our high school and collegiate career, you would use this transition statement, and I took this from you, and you would go, speaking of running, we're going to jump into, Overtime podcast today, which has nothing to do with running at all. And you'd use this transition when we would be super distracted and get us back on track.
Not that we ever did that in high school.
Yeah. And just to clarify, the reason Jeff owes us a beer is because we ended up beating him in the end of that.
Yeah, we
Yes,
did
you
win.
did.
Yes.
We
Yeah,
did
you
win.
guys finished about 3 weeks before me.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
That was pretty good.
Yeah.
So, man, it's embarrassing to be beat by 320 something. So
It is.
Just
It
felt like a
is.
lose-lose for
Yeah.
us. It was like
Yeah.
we either win with 3 of us or we lose. I was like, I don't know.
Yeah.
what to do. And he was
Yeah.
running for a cause. We just were running to beat him.
Yes.
Like he was running to raise money. It was just like, I'm like, this is rough for
Yep.
us. But
I would not have finished as quick as I did because I had 6 months and I did
Yeah.
it in 4.5. You guys did it in probably just under 4.
Yeah.
But I would not have done it as quickly as I did if it were not for our competition.
well, I'm glad we could help
You're
you
welcome.
and inspire you, Jeff.
Yeah. Well, using the transition, there is no good way to transition into our question for this podcast. But I will shortly recap, what Sunday was, and for 2 purposes: 1, to let our listeners be reminded of, and 2, to encourage our listeners or watchers to go and watch the message, because we are really picking up this conversation as part 2. And part 2 is going to feel a little bit like we're diving in pretty fast if you haven't had part 1. And so to anybody watching or listening, make sure you go back and you check out the message, because at the end of the message, we actually got to interview you, Jeff, and went to your house, and we, set up some cameras in your living room, and we interviewed you talking about your story, because we're talking about this series, Next Level, taking our faith to the next level. And there are seasons of faith in our journeys of faith, our stories of faith, where we bump into something that is difficult. And like Jordan alluded to, as he began to kind of unpack these difficult seasons and how this grows our faith, you are the individual, really for both of us, that has probably gone through the most difficult thing you can possibly go through in this lifetime. And you talked about that in the interview, and you lost your son Garrett about 10 years ago, and shared a little bit about that. And again, I would just encourage anybody who is watching or listening, go watch the message on Sunday. Go to mpaustin.com, go to watch, and go to the most recent message, because you'll be able to check that out there. Because we're going to jump into a question, and there's 2 parts of this podcast, and we're going to answer this question a little bit more further that Jordan brought up in his message on Sunday, but then we're going to talk about a little bit of the how and the walk of faith piece, and really want to get your insight on that too. But the question, very broadly, is one that many people have, and that is that, why would a good God allow suffering? And this is something that I personally bump into all the time. We bump into a lot in student ministry as students are wrestling with faith and they have questions. And this seems to be the one that trips up, 75% of people. I mean, it seems to be the biggest one. And so I really want to tackle this question first, and then we're going to talk a little bit in the midst of suffering, what do we do in our faith piece? But yeah, how would you guys kind of start to answer that question? Why would a good God allow suffering?
Well, I know one thing up front is whether it's you asking the question or you're talking to someone who's asking that question, you can come at it from 2 perspectives. One is an intellectual thing. I'm intellectually evaluating the claims of Christianity, and here's something that I'm stuck on. The other is experientially, that I've been through something terrible, and I just have trouble accepting a God who would have allowed me to go through that. So I think that's like the first step, is just asking yourself or someone else, or understanding what's the perspective from which you're coming at this question?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's important that if it's kind of on the experiential side, and specifically, how close you are to a chaotic season or moment or whatever the pivotal circumstance, that'd be the phrase that we used on Sunday. If you're looking to this question as a source of healing, right, that's going to change a little bit based on your personality, how helpful it is. But I think it's important to clarify that if it's the experiential reason, answering this question, even if we were to nail it on this podcast today, and all kinds of brilliant people have tried to answer this question, but that's not going to take the pain away from the instance of suffering. That's not where the healing is found per se. Now, Jeff, I think you've talked about, like, based on your wiring, it can be helpful in maybe being able to frame and understand and all that kind of stuff, and that might be a little bit different for each person. But I want to start with that because we're going to go kind of intellectual, we're going to go theological through some of this. Yeah. And if you're hoping to be like, man, I'm going to sit down and listen to this and the pain's going to go away, that would be kind of a false hope or expectation for where we're going.
That's a great point, Jordan. And my experience is exactly that. I mean, I still have pain from what I went through. I understood this answer before I encountered this pain. Right. It's something that it was an interesting theological topic to me. So it's something that I had studied and read and listened to a lot of stuff on. But certainly it has no bearing on removing the pain. And depending on who you are, it is more or less satisfying. You mentioned Selena and I, and there's a particular message series done by John Piper that talks about this, and it was very, very helpful for me. It was one of the more helpful things that I read or listened to. But for a long time, Selena wouldn't even listen to it. And it wasn't probably for a couple of years later that finally she agreed. And when she did, her response was just, it wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be. It was marginally helpful for her, whereas it was very helpful for me. And ultimately, the core answer I think we're going to land on is that particular thing that I'm talking about.
Yeah, and I think I would just attest to that too. I mean, I do remember in small group, because Jordan and I kind of growing up in church, but you have the Orthodox background, and I didn't grow up in church, and so coming into it with these questions, we both had kind of an intellectual bend towards trying to discover whether Christianity was going to be a part of our life, and you opened up a space for us to ask these questions, and I remember you talking through the answer to it, and then I also remember watching you emotionally grapple with the answers to the questions in that season of life, and that's really the reason why we want to hear from you on this topic. And so I think with any of these questions, there are it's a wheel, and there's a lot of spokes to the wheel. Yeah. And probably the more complex questions we ask in life, the more caveats there are with the question. And so I want to drill down into a couple different sub questions that might help us figure this out. And the first is the problem of good and evil in the first place. We talk about, why would a good God allow suffering? That means God is good. There's evil. Okay, well, why do we even see these things in the first place? Why do we see evil at all in the world if God is good? How would y'all answer that?
Yeah, see, for me, this is why this question is so dynamic, and it feels kind of personal in that, I remember the days where I used this question as an argument against the Christian faith. And today I'm in a place where this question is actually a foundation of an argument for the Christian faith in my perspective. That's how much of kind of a 180 that I've done on it. And what I mean by that is, if you remove God from the equation, if it's being used as an attack on Christianity, for me, the question breaks down. It's no longer a coherent, logical question anymore. In terms of the fact that if there is no God, good and evil become illusions. They're not, there's no foundation, there's no absolute to place those in, right? We are the result of, at our best guess, a cosmic accident, an explosion, and we're dust, we're particles, we're molecules, we're really rocks that can make noise. I mean, that's really what we are. And in a universe that, 14 billion years old, then it's we're here today, gone tomorrow. We can make absolutely no indent on this universe, right? And so the depth of kind of meaninglessness in that scenario, not to create too bleak of a picture, that's just what it is. Good and evil become these kind of constructs that we come up with to perhaps understand our stories or to be able to communicate with one another, something like that. But they're just not real, right? Yeah. They're not based in anything. Again, I like the rocks kind of analogy. So, and I think that's important, because if you're going to walk away, because of pain or suffering in the world, you got to think about what you're walking towards, which to me is an even more bleak situation. You were in the intersection at the wrong place at the wrong time. Just shouldn't have been driving that day. There's no greater picture working out. There's no that kind of thing. So, part of that is why I say it points me to, right? Because this problem of evil and suffering is like, I don't think that's livable. And I don't think anybody from kind of any worldview could say that seems real, that you could live this life and say that's in check with reality, that there is no such thing as good and there is no such thing as evil. And so not to evaluate all worldviews and religions, but this is what works me towards Christianity a little bit, in that Christianity uniquely has a couple of factors that come together. One, it says evil and suffering is real. Mm-hmm. And not all faiths and not all philosophies have that in common. Some would say it's relative. Some would say there's an absence of good in certain scenarios, but there's not like an anti-good, which is evil, right? Mm-hmm. So one, Christianity affirms that your evil is real. The other thing that Christianity does is it deals with evil and suffering, right? So in a faith or a worldview where you just hope your good outweighs your bad, and if I'm 51% good, then the 49% of the wrong and bad in my life is just forgotten about, like it's swept under the rug, and that's happening for all humanity, right? That lands more on the good side. Whereas in Christianity alone, justice is done at the cross. Like sin is paid for, and God says, I'm going to sacrifice my own son for that. It's not ignored. It came at incredible cost, right? And so there's a couple of unique elements of the Christian worldview. You can't just lump all religions in here, that affirms evil and suffering is real, and we're going to deal with it. And I think both of those are compelling to me. So I don't know if you guys would add anything to that before we kind of keep answering the question, but in terms of the evil and suffering, kind of conundrum, those are relevant to me in answering the question.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think those are great points, Jordan. And you're right that if there is not a God, and this is just some accident, and we're the result of just a series of random mutations, then there is no such thing as an absolute good or an absolute evil. Mm-hmm. And I think what we do as people is we might want to say there isn't a God, but then we want to define, things like good and evil, and effectively then, while no one would say they're doing this, effectively they're being God.
Yeah, it's so interesting. It feels just like a dishonest pursuit to me. I mean, I've looked at a lot of brilliant people try to do it. I'm not saying nobody else tries to, but the stretch that they have to go through, and why would you even have, why do you even feel compelled to have the conversation? I mean, we could go on too much of a side tangent with that, but, it's interesting. It breaks down quick.
I don't know. Do y'all listen to Jordan Peterson at all?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So he had Stephen Fry on, I don't know, a couple months ago. Made Ashley listen to it in the car with me, and she hated it. But I was riveted. And, I love Stephen Fry. I mean, he's the voice on all the Harry Potter books. And as I've mentioned before many times, I'm a huge Harry Potter fan. And so he just has that, he just sounds smart. He's got the British, deep voice, right? And Jordan Peterson interviewed him. Did y'all listen to that one?
No, I haven't heard that one.
So this one, I mean, Jordan Peterson, if you listen to this for any reason, then you're a very smart man, and I highly respect you. But Jordan Peterson seems to be going through a question of his own faith, and based on what I've heard him talk about on his podcast, just in the last 6 months or so, and Stephen Fry is one of the four horsemen of that they call the atheist horsemen of our time, and they were talking about the idea of better, making a life better. And for something to be better, that means that it's not good enough currently, and it's going to be more good, I guess, as a result of being better. And we all want to make our lives better. And, Jordan Peterson just kind of drilled down on him over and over again and said, you want your life to be better tomorrow, right? And he's like, yeah, of course. I want to wake up tomorrow. I want to, he's saying it in his British accent. It's awesome. And then Jordan Peterson just said, why? How can you justify trying to make your life better based on what you believe? And it just, they never answered it. They never talked about it, But what Jordan Peterson did talk about is how this thing of good and evil, you don't just see it in kind of intellectual conversations, but you see good and evil even ingrained in animals today, where you see these tribal mentalities and, protecting each other, this good and evil, even in the way animals with a less developed prefrontal cortex, it is everywhere. Good and evil is a part of our DNA. And, what Solomon would say, eternity is written on man's heart. There could be something there that it's pointing us to God, not away from.
Yeah.
So, that's a lot. I would say if, go back and listen to what Jordan said, because what Jordan said, I think there was a lot to it.
Yeah.
And the amount of research and books and conversations have probably led you to be able to like summarize that answer in that way is a ton. And so if you're going, man, I don't know, go back, hit rewind, like go listen to, that a couple times. I want to drill down on more of the purpose of pain. What is the purpose of pain then? If we accept the reality that we live in a world of good and evil and, there's good things and we're suffering, well then why suffering? What's the purpose of suffering in our life?
Yeah, I think, we can have a few answers to this, and I'm sure Jordan and I and you will probably have some things we can say. But because we are not God, we did not structure and create this universe that includes pain. Mm-hmm. I don't think we can fully answer this question, but I do think there are some things we can see. And, one of them for me is that pain points us to something better. If you put your hand on a hot stove, that pain points you to remove your hand from the stove. And there are many life choices we make that cause pain, and that pain causes us to redirect.
Yeah.
And that just seems to be part of God's nature. One of the things that I think of on this topic is God introduced the law through Moses. And it was, I think, about 1,200 years later that Christ came and was sacrificed on our behalf. So God let, I don't even know how many generations that is, 1,200 years worth of people try to earn salvation by doing what the law required. And just again and again and again, as you read the Old Testament, they couldn't do it. And we couldn't do it now.
Yeah.
But I think that part of the reason God let humankind struggle that long is to really point to Christ. And when that answer comes, it is really well received by those people who have just seen that they cannot make it and they've suffered in this pain and sin. So I think that is, one of the purposes of pain is to point us to relief of some kind.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, this is actually kind of the timing of this. I don't want to make it too much of a side tangent, but I just had to write a paper for school on this like last week, and it was on the different covenants and then how, Christ finally fulfills that. But you just basically it's, church term for this agreement, this desire of God to have a relationship with us. In whole Old Testament, you just see us messing up our side of the agreement again and again and again and again, especially when you go through it fast. That's what really sticks out. And so finally, God is like, I'm going to step in myself is more or less what happens. I mean, he sends his son, right, God in human form, to fulfill our side of the agreement that we could not because he so desperately desires relationship with us, And that's received, exactly what you were just saying because of that build up too and because of the pain and because we kept falling it short. But it just adds this incredible weight to Christ, like the more you dive in and understand all of that. So I think, something that is like similar to that, in the same vein of what, Jeff is saying, that this, pain will point you to something better, is I think at times, that it's almost like the more painful that you could say the ultimate pains in life perhaps point to the ultimate good, and that ultimate good is God. And I think there are elements of God's character that we know and understand because of pain that I don't think we could otherwise. So, for example, him being a merciful God, him being a gracious God, a forgiving God, right? Things like restoration and reconciliation and redemption, all of these require like something was broke, right? Something was messed up. There was pain. There was suffering that took place. And God is restoring these things. He's pursuing us in all of those. And we wouldn't know all that if everything was just vanilla, if it was all just stagnant and the same, there's this kind of the opposite of good thing. That's why I think evil is so important. It's the opposite of good. It's not just the absence of good is the opposite of good, right? And that's so important. And so there's a lot of those elements that you see in there as well. And I think one of the other reasons that we hit on this Sunday, so I won't expand on it too long, it's just because like Paul, James, they're real clear on it that I think these are almost like kind of subpoints to a bigger thing Jeff will land on later, but they do talk about how it grows our character and our maturity and our faith, right? They use this like kind of word like completeness, this completeness, maturity of your faith, that you could say that's what the better is being pointed to. But there is this process of just, like a parent that loves their child that might let them endure, a pain to to learn a lesson, to grow, to be stronger in the future when the parent could reach in and save them, or some things that are too complicated for an infant or a baby to understand that a parent isn't going to try to explain, but they allow them to go through these pains because they know what's coming for them in the future. There's this greater good that's coming and that the pain is pointing to and preparing them for. So
yeah. As you were talking, it's interesting. I kept thinking about, this is like totally a different category, but I'll explain how it relates. But Jocko Willink's discipline equals freedom concept. I don't know if y'all have heard this, but he's the Navy SEAL. He wrote Extreme Ownership. And just, when you meet these guys who have gone through some of the most painful things, with 9/11 coming up, Ashley and I have been watching these documentaries, which is why it's kind of been on my mind. But some of these guys would say, like, this discipline equals freedom. No, you put yourself through pain on purpose, so you experience freedom in life. And I think intellectually that's pretty easy to, like, okay, yeah, I can understand how that makes sense. When it comes to faith, though, is where it like breaks down for a lot of people. Like, why would we go through difficult things in faith to produce a new kind of faith? But that's what we see. It's these painful moments in faith can sometimes do something that we wouldn't have otherwise been able to experience on the other side of our Heavenly Father.
Yeah. I think the other thing to remember on this, and Jordan, you kind of hit on this in the message on Sunday, is that a lot of the examples we've used are things where you intentionally do something that creates pain and will then result in growth. But there's a lot of things, and with my loss, one of the things that's just unfortunately natural for a parent is to question, what did I do wrong? And could I have done something different? So there is a component of what was my part. As you guys know, Garrett passed away by taking his own life. And so as parents, we struggle with that. But when I step back and I look at just, the hundreds and thousands of families I've, experienced and known, I don't see something that we did that would have resulted in that. And I see, many kids growing up in far worse situations that don't resort to that. So mostly with my circumstance, and then others like natural disasters where you had no bearing on that. And I think that's when this question becomes more real is, okay, I cheated on my spouse and now I'm divorced. That's not really God's fault. That's my fault.
Yeah.
Hypothetical, I'm still married to my first wife.
Yeah.
But there's other things that you can feel like you have very little or no causal impact. And those are the ones where this question becomes more real and more hard.
Yeah.
Right. Yep.
Absolutely. Let's drill down on the question again. So we've talked about 3 different spokes to the question. We talked about, why do we see evil at all? We talked about, Christianity kind of being unique in its perspective of pain. It's a little different than the rest of the world's perspective. And then kind of the purpose of pain as a whole. So with those as our backdrop, how would y'all answer? Why would a good God allow suffering?
Yeah, I think so. I'm going to try to hit maybe like a couple points because I really want to leave it to Jeff, just his experience and perspective. And I love the way he kind of talks about his final point we're building to. So I'll start with the C.S. Lewis quote real quick that I think is clarifying. He says in The Case for Christianity, so again, this is where he's kind of using this suffering as an argument for God. He says, God created things which had free will. And we've had some offline debates about even that phrase. We like the phrase meaningful choice that Randy Alcorn writes. But, free will, meaningful choice. God created things that had free will. That means creatures which can go wrong or right. Some people think they can imagine a creature which was free but had no possibility of going wrong, but I can't. If a thing is free to be good, it's also free to be bad, and free will is what has made evil possible. So I lead with that quote, and there's actually a lot more to it. It's kind of cool how he continues to build his case off of that. But ultimately, what he argues, he's like, hey, if we were a world of robots, it would be incompatible with a loving God to create a world of robots. And that's not what we are. And so a God that allows us to make choices that have destructive consequences and decisions, that allows us to choose something other than him, allows for the possibility of evil and suffering to happen, which is exactly what happened. So part of the answer to this is, let's go back to Genesis, it's the fall. It's sin in the world. Paul talks in Romans about how sin affects everything, contaminates everything. I mean, you could even go to natural disasters and stuff stuff like that,
Right.
to say, you know, we're living in a sinful world that has been affected by, contaminated by sin, and given the opportunity to choose something other than God, which is essentially sin. That's what we've done, and we've all done that, you know, repeatedly. So we're living in a broken world. That's part of the answer that a loving God gives us the ability to make those meaningful decisions. And I think on the flip side of that, if you're like, well, why didn't he just create a world? I think C.S. Lewis already partly answers, well, like we wouldn't, we'd be robots, which is not what a loving God would create. But I think the flip side is, you know, the world you wanted God to create. And I think, Jeff, you were the first one to phrase this way to me, and I've used this on stage again and again. It's just so memorable to me, of like that world we all think we wanted God to create. No pain, no suffering, no cancer, no natural disasters, no murder, no rape, you know, whatever it is, like the worst of the world, like just get rid of all that. Like he absolutely created it. And that place is called heaven. And we have the decision of whether we want to join him there or not, but not based on how we behave or what we do, but based on whether or not we place our trust in Christ. And, you know, again, that's where the intellectual doesn't quite always meet the same as the emotional. But
Right.
I mean, this world is a blip. There's no words to put it in how short this world is compared to eternity. That's our home. He's prepared a place for us. He's waiting for us there. All the good things you could ever dream of, like waiting for us, real place, physical place. So he has absolutely created that thing that you think the good, loving God should have created. But he also created this temporary place where we have the freedom to choose opposite of him. And we've done that. So for me, I know it can be like a weird twist away, and especially it can almost feel like heartless if you're in the midst of suffering or something to phrase it this way. But like for me, it comes down to love. And love leaves room for destructive decisions. And God didn't leave us in our destructive consequences, but he came after us, you know, first through these covenants and agreements and finally through Christ. But for me, that's like one really helpful answer to the question for me. And then I think the like bigger final, I think I would leave up to you, because I can't articulate it like you can. So.
Yeah. And really quick, Jeff, before you jump in, I think everything Jordan said feels like it does answer like a massive part of that question. There is some intellectual like acceptance you can get to with that, but there is the category that you brought up, you know, just previously too. Like, what do you do? Like, you could natural disasters. Yeah, there could be a human component to that, but still, there are things in this world that, you know, even where you're born, you know, we're grateful to be born in the U.S. But I mean, golly, somebody being born in Afghanistan right now, somebody being born in a different third, you know, like how do you reconcile those things? You know, that's still hard for us to intellectually, you know, get around.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's, you know, that's something, a question I was interested in intellectually before losing Garrett. And then after that, it became much more real. And I think the part of the Bible that addresses this most is the book of Job. And, you know, you guys are familiar with the story. Job was a guy that in the very beginning of the book, it says he was the most righteous man on the earth at that time, somebody that was, you know, leading a very good life and well-respected by everybody. And there's a conversation between God and Satan that's taking place, where Satan is saying that, well, the only reason he is doing all the good things he's doing is because you're blessing him. And so asks if he can do something bad to take away the blessing effectively, and then see how Job responds. And that ultimately results in a storm that caused a house to collapse, killing all of his children. Other things happened where he lost most of his possessions. So, you know, the worst stuff you could possibly imagine. And, you know, you can read through a passage like that. It's just a few verses, and you can cover it in about 15 seconds. But if you just step back and think, what would that have been like? It's just overwhelming. Mm-hmm. And the bulk of the book of Job is Job talking with his friends who first came and did a great job of comforting. And by the way, let me just a slight tangent there. When people go through something like that, or even just maybe a loss of an older grandparent who's lived a great life, and it's maybe not as tragic feeling, people always want to like, I just don't know what to say. And the beginning of the book of Job is the best example. There's really not anything you can say. And I still remember you guys coming over. You know, we stayed at the Binfords, just some great friends of ours who opened up their home and let us come stay there, because obviously from what happened, we couldn't immediately go back into our house. And you guys came over and so many other people, and I don't remember what you said. And I probably wouldn't have remembered if you had asked me a week later, but just your presence and all the others that came, that is what is so meaningful. So that's what Job's friends did at first, was just came and mourned with them. But then as they started talking, things went bad. And, read the book, the book of Job to see. But really where it comes down to is Job and they are asking the question, how could this have happened to me? Job, I want my day in court before God. And God answers him. After them going back and forth in chapter 38, God finally answers and says, who is this that darkens my counsel with words without knowledge? Brace yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. And then he goes on, I can't remember, I think it's around 65 questions that he asked, but he starts with, where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. So he starts with that question. He just asks question after question after question. And it results in Job's response a couple chapters later. He says, I am unworthy. How can I reply to you? I put my hand over my mouth. I spoke once, but I have no answer. Twice, but I will say no more. And basically God's answer to him is, look at what I've done that demonstrates my omnipotence and my power as God, and then compare that to you. And you just cannot understand. And that's the point that for some people that's really unsatisfying. But you used the analogy of a kid before, and this analogy used to be so great, but unfortunately it's become politicized. But I'm gonna use it anyways because I just think it's wonderful. And regardless of which side you land on this thing, I just pray that you could take this in the intent that I mean it to really, I think, show a good example. Is when our children were young, when Autumn had to go get a vaccination for polio, I don't remember, probably 6 months or something like that. We didn't bring with us a binder that had pictures showing, here's what it would look like if you got polio. She's getting the shot and crying in the pain. We didn't try to show her, here's what would happen, or here's how your life would be impacted. Without polio, she went on to be, a volleyball player and played club and high school volleyball. Probably with polio, that wouldn't have happened because of the impact on her body. But yet we didn't share any of that with her because, anybody listening would know the foolishness of trying to explain a 6-month-old why they're getting this shot and what it might prevent them from experiencing later. You simply hug them. Hug them and tell them you love them. And I think that's just what God does. And he was a little firm with Job, but it's like, look, you cannot understand this. My mind is so much greater than yours. This is beyond your comprehension, the answer to this question. But I love you.
I think, getting into, we've talked a lot about the why, how we answer this question. Let's drill down a little bit more with what you were just talking about, the how. And, the how Job experienced that and how he responded and how he dealt with the suffering and the pain. He was, I think Jordan and I really just, want to listen and hear from you, like how. So, knowing is not enough. How do we get through these things? And I'd be curious, you've never shared this with us, and so maybe it's not good to ask on the podcast, and we'll cut it out if we need to. But like that moment, what you just read, it's almost like, golly, that's in the Bible. Like Job, I don't know when Job was written, thousands of years ago. But a man screaming out to God saying, why would you allow suffering in this world? The same question people are asking today.
Yeah.
And that's in the Bible. Like, it's asked and God responds, and that's incredible. I guess my question for you is, like, what was the realization for you? Like, how did you read that, and when did it kind of connect dots for you in the midst of what you were going through?
Yeah, for me, I mentioned I think I mentioned John Piper. John Piper did one of his regional conferences at Hill Country Bible Church in, I think it was 2008, and it was Job, When the Righteous Suffer. So I had been equipped with a lot of this stuff intellectually before I experienced this. And I think if we're trying to give people help on, what can I do if, you're a person and you're in the place where, you haven't experienced a significant tragedy yet in your life, praise God. And maybe you won't, but, statistically you're going to at some point. And so by listening to this podcast and the message on Sunday is good for you just to intellectually be prepared. But that doesn't, like you asked me in the interview, Jordan, that doesn't fully prepare you for that type of a experience, something that's really traumatic.
Yeah. So what do you do today? What did you do back then that helped you kind of walk through and experience some peace with the midst of what you were going through?
I had a brief moment the night that it happened. After things had finally settled down, we got situated at Benford's house. Autumn had made it back from college, and I went out by myself in the truck, and I just yelled at God. I yelled at Garrett. I was so angry at both of them. And for me, that pretty much got it out of my system. But Selena struggled for a much longer time. And so people are different, and I think that's something people need to understand, is that how you're going to experience, a tragedy, there's not one size that fits all. So I had a brief period of time where I did that, but then I think so much of it is, like I mentioned in the interview, it just knocked the wind out of me, and I had nothing I could do but just lean into God. And then people like you and other friends and family who are just there to support us and hold us. I really, there's few pieces that I can remember clearly, but a lot of it I don't even remember. I think I was just in such shock.
Yeah, this is, I know you're the host, and I know this is not a plain question, but there are just as many people, experiencing, suffering as there are probably people wanting to care for somebody in a situation they can't relate with, they can't empathize. I haven't experienced the depth of what you've experienced. I know you've just talked about like a physical presence, and comfort, but is there anything you would say to people that are like trying to be a friend, trying to love somebody that is going through something they can't understand? Anything you'd say?
Yeah, I think I like what you said, they can't understand. And that's one of the things that I mentioned on the interview, that as a pastor, I would try to empathize with people. But there are some things you just cannot understand until you experience it. And as someone who's been through something really difficult, if somebody who hasn't been through anything like that tries to tell you understand, it's a bit offensive. And nobody ever really offended me heavily, but it could be offensive. I think the best thing you can do is just love on them. Are there practical needs you can take care of? What can you do for them? People in the midst of, some heavy suffering probably just can't care for themselves, whether it's mowing their yard or making meals or running errands. And, what can you just do practically to love them and help them? Yeah, I'm just thinking of some specific things that people did for us during that time and how meaningful it was.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. What are I think that's helpful for people who are going through things, and people who are not going through things. Sitting on the other side of you right now, and hearing, and also thinking about what you said in the end of the video on Sunday. And you very much so, talked about being weaker today as a result of what you'd experienced, 10 years ago. I couldn't help but think of, the passage where Paul says, your grace is sufficient in my weakness. And I kept thinking about that because I watched the video probably 15 times, from editing it to like seeing it on Sunday, multiple services.
Sorry you had to do that.
No, my eyes watered every single time I watched it, just because I remember Garrett, and I remember experiencing, an ounce of the emotions you were feeling. And you just said something that I think perhaps takes any follower of Jesus decades to fully comprehend. Your grace is sufficient in my weakness. Can you, if you can, unpack what that means to you, how that's a part of your faith today? You did a little bit in the video, but I just don't know if there's anything you would add to.
Yeah, I think, maybe more than directly answering that question, indirectly is, up to that point, that happened when I was in my early 40s. And for the most part, things had gone pretty smoothly. There's a lot of people who are substantially more successful than me. I was no Elon Musk, but things had gone well. I did well in college. I was doing well in career, and things had, a lot of things had gone well, and I had put effort into it. And so you can think, wow, look what I did. Look what I'm capable of. Look what my abilities are. And I think when you experience something like this, it humbles you and it makes you realize you're not all that. And it forces you to lean into God. And if you don't have a relationship with God, if you don't know who God is, I'm amazed at people who go through what I've been through without knowing God. I don't know how they do it.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, it'd be especially kind of some of the intellectual things we've talked about, and any ounce of peace or rest that you can come to. Obviously not emotionally satisfying, but yeah, it'd be difficult to experience some of those things without kind of a rock to turn to.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this I've heard Andy Stanley talk about this of like, a lot of times people might use the why suffering as an argument, but he's like, man, in my experience as 45 years, I think, as a pastor, he's like, so often when people walk through suffering, it is the thing that points to God, because it is the like, where else am I going to go with this? Where else am I going to find real hope, real healing, real peace? Like, what are my other options? And so often it's like this intellectual jab by people that are leveraging other people's suffering, leveraging somebody on the other side of the planet that they've never met to argue against God. And he was always like, don't do that. Like, talk about your own experience, whatever. But like, because he's like, for me, when I see people walk through suffering, it comes to this place of where else am I going to go? And it's just so interesting. I think it's interesting if, somebody's watching this and they are wrestling with where they're at in the faith. I think this is part of those, like, those conversations that pull you out of just the mundane of life and like make you really wrestle with some of the biggest questions. Whether you have experience or, pain is in your future or whatever that might be, it's like, man, where else would you go?
Yeah, and it ties back into the question we're trying to answer with the relatively unsatisfying answer of we can't understand is if the real answer to this is so far beyond our comprehension and there's only one entity that can comprehend it, God, who else would you want to lean into in the pain but the one person who can understand it?
Yeah, and that's really, Jesus' words, you'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free. Regardless of how easy it is for us to stomach the truth, coming to that conclusion can still be very freeing for people, to be able to accept that truth that God is God, and there are things that we can't comprehend and we can't understand.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anything, Jeff, as we wrap up, anything else, I guess if you're, have the opportunity to talk to somebody who is going through something difficult and trying to grapple with faith, trying to get to the other side with a stronger faith, stronger person, what would you say to them if they're listening right now?
That's a good question. So I think, God can handle your questions and your pain and your anger. So don't feel like you need to hide that from him. If you believe God is the omnipotent creator of all that he is, you can't hide it from him anyways.
Yeah.
So I think that's clearly one. The other is to the extent that you can find someone, it's not a new duty that I enjoy, but my wife and I have spoken with many other couples who have lost a child, having been through that. And the reason we do that is it's not anything that we enjoy, but one of the most helpful things for me was a gentleman who had reached out through a mutual friend. I knew him casually through church, but what I didn't know is that 30 years before, he had been through the same thing that I had been through. His high school-age son took his life. And, it was the morning of your graduation. When you gave the speech that morning, I met with him. So that was probably less than a week after it happened. It was very, very close. And then he invited me. He had a ranch and invited me out there just to spend a day, and went out there and talked with him. And that was a very helpful thing, getting to being able to spend time with him as someone who it had been 30 years. So he in our specific situation, I remember he asked me 3 questions, and I can only remember 2 of them, but one of them is, how has this impacted your relationship with God? And so I think that's a good question to ask, regardless of what happened, and how is this impacting your relationship with your wife? And so that was very helpful. So I'd encourage people to try to seek out someone who's been through what you've been through and kind of help you visualize. So, and then a small one I'll tack on is just a practical thing is, one of the two things that caused me to start running is before this happened, I was standing in the kitchen without a shirt on, and Garrett reached over and patted me on the belly and said, "Oh, Dad, that's a nice little beer gut you're working on there." So I was like, okay, I got to do something about this. So I kind of toyed with running a little bit, but after his death, running became a very therapeutic thing for me. And I know that from listening to lots of podcasts and reading running books and stuff, it's not uncommon, especially people who run really long distances, to have gotten into that because of tragedy. And so whether it's running or something else, I think there's a physical side, just like the spiritual side to our body, there's a physical side. And, what you really want to do is just like lie in bed. But there's real value to getting out and, doing something, whether it's running or something else that gets your heart rate up, gets you exerting yourself. And
you can get some dopamine running through your system.
Yes, yeah. Endocannabinoids. Yeah.
That's what I was going to say.
Listeners, go Google that. It's free, internally made THC-like substance that gets generated when you run at moderate intensity pace.
What if you run really slow? Does it still, like I do?
I run very slow, and I definitely get some endocannabinoids going.
Okay,
so
that's good.
But yeah, that's good. And then the other thing about running, as Jordan and I were talking about this earlier, is that there's a level of suffering that comes with, like, especially really long distance runnings, like doing an ultra marathon. And it's terrible when you're doing it. But the feeling when you finish, if you're running and I don't know, I think the first one I did, it was 41 miles, and I was 24 miles in, and I thought, okay, I feel absolutely horrible right now.
Yeah.
But it was 2 20.5 mile laps, so I had no other choice but to keep going. And when you feel that bad and you persist for, it was probably another 3 or 4 hours of running and walking, it feels absolutely horrible while you're doing it. But there's something afterwards that is just undescribable. And I think that ties back into what we're talking about, is suffering is not pleasant, but when you come out on the other end, there's definitely benefits and growth that takes place.
Awesome. Well, Jeff, thank you very, very much, for what you've done in our life, for one, and then, just your impact on Northpoint over the years, and your vulnerability to do this. Genuinely, thank you from bottom of my heart, and also just thank you on behalf of all of Northpoint, because I know your words have touched a lot of people. I mean, just being in the room on Sunday, and that's not even the people who ended up watching online. Who knows what they experienced, but it was very, very impactful. So thanks for your vulnerability.
You're welcome.
And your story with that.
Yeah, it was good to get to see you guys again. And I'm going to steal something that Buck, I always used to hear Buck say, after he delivered a great message and people are telling him, hey, great job, praise God.
Yeah.
Because
still says it.
Yeah, he does.
Yeah, anything that was good for me, I definitely do not want to come out of here like, oh, look at Jeff Brown. I want to come out of here with people saying, look at God. So pointing to him.
Yeah. To wrap us up, this is a bit unique. Would you mind praying just for our time?
Sure.
And for people listening, whatever they're going through?
Yeah.
Cool.
Heavenly Father, thank you for this opportunity for us to have this talk amongst 3 old friends. Well, 1 old friend and 2 young friends. But God, I just thank you for this opportunity to have this conversation that's so important. And I pray for each of the people listening, whether they fall into the category of pre-suffering, they're currently suffering, or they're post-suffering. I just pray for each of them that they could feel your presence, feel your spirit, and feel and understand that you are in control of this universe, even when it feels like it is completely out of control. And Lord, we just thank you for all these things in the powerful, redeeming name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Awesome. Jeff, thank you. And to those listening, we'll see you this week as we wrap up next level up. That's what Buck did. We wrap up level up with part 5. All right. See you Sunday.